Again, 1 Timothy chapter 4, we'll read verses 7 through verse 9. But refuse profane and old wives' fables, and exercise thyself rather unto godliness. For bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, having promise of the life that now is, and of that which is to come. This is a faithful saying, and worthy of all acceptation. Again, Paul is writing to Timothy to instruct, to encourage him to stay the course in the midst of a variety of error, departures from the faith, and many problems and difficult and trying circumstance. He exhorts Timothy to do certain things as their pastor. Again, he's over the church of Ephesus. In verse 6, he says, "If thou put the brethren in remembrance," that is, rehearse, teach continually, over and over, instruct, and preach diligently, faithfully, and comprehensibly. And if he does these things, he shall be a good minister, as becomes one who is nourished up in the words of faith and of good doctrine. In other words, if he does these things as pastor of the church of Ephesus, he will manifest that he has been trained in these things. And then Paul, in verse 7, directs Timothy's attention to his own personal spiritual life, his personal walk with God. And he says, refuse, again, decline, turn down, reject profane and old wives' fables. That is, Timothy, do not consider them worthy of importance so that they occupy your time, is basically what he's saying. It is an extension of the instruction given in 1 Timothy 1, verse 4. Neither give heed to fables, that is, do not pay attention to fables and endless genealogies, which minister questions rather than godly edifying, which in faith so do. So verse 7 is an extension of that. What we read in verse 7 is Proverbs 4, verses 14 and 15, if we turn there. Proverbs 4, verse 14, "Enter not into the path of the wicked, go not in the way of evil men, avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, pass away." In other words, stay away from it, refuse it, reject it. We need spiritual discipline. Discipline knows how to say no to certain things in order that we can say yes to the right things. We have to have the discipline to say, no, I'm not going to do that. No. And we have to be able, we must have the discipline to say no. It is avoid one thing so that you can pursue something else. What he's saying in verse 7 is you avoid profane and old wives' fables so that you can pursue godliness. If you do not reject these things, you cannot pursue godliness. We have to reject these things. They get in the way. They're a hindrance. So he says, refuse. Have the discipline to say no. Know what's important. And if you know what's important, you can say no. No. And then in verse 7 of our text, he continues his exhortation. And refuse profane and old wives' fables. And, that is, in addition to refusing these things, in addition to not considering them worthy of your time, exercise thyself. Rather, that is, instead of profane and old wives' fables, exercise thyself rather unto godliness. And as you read verses 7 and 8, there is a parallel between exercise unto godliness and bodily exercise. It is a parallel between an athlete striving for the prize and the child of God striving after being what they ought to be for God. The idea being conveyed in our text is that of rigorous spiritual discipline. And this unto godliness. If Timothy is going to achieve verse 12, there must be spiritual, personal discipline unto godliness. So the reality of living the Christian life demands discipline. For the most part, people seriously lack in our society self-discipline. Self-discipline. It is bringing ourselves under rule. We need to have spiritual discipline. Again, what is written in our text is to Timothy, but we must not limit our view of what is said to Timothy, but to our own spiritual life. So I want to speak on the subject of spiritual discipline. Spiritual discipline. We have a command, verse 7, exercise thyself rather unto godliness. You just think of the word exercise. To do it continually requires discipline. Discipline yourself is what Paul is saying. Exercise thyself. Discipline. It is a command to self-discipline. The Greek word translated exercise is gymnazo. Gymnazo. And what it means in the Greek is to strip down, to remove the clothes. It has reference to the practice of that day regarding those who would compete in Olympic Games and such and such. They would go to a specified place of training and they would remove their outer garments, anything that would get in the way, anything that would restrict them, anything that would hold them back in their training, So this Greek word translated exercise carries over into the English word gymnasium. Gymnasium. When Paul says, exercise thyself rather unto godliness, he has this image in his mind of the place where the athlete would submit to a program, to a coach, to a trainer, pushing themselves, pushing themselves, pushing themselves. That's something we lack in our society, pushing ourselves. And here it is pushing themselves to the very limit, hoping for the prize. All of this to prepare for a temporal prize. And the success of these athletes would be due in large part to the diligence of their discipline and the intensity of their training and preparation. No one would be so illogical, at least I hope, to show up for a marathon without preparation. You don't roll out of bed and say, you know what, I'm going to run 30 miles today. It takes training. It takes discipline. You can watch. You can be a spectator watching people run a marathon, but that won't prepare you to run it. You need discipline. You need discipline. And it's not just sporadic. It's discipline over an extended period of time. So Paul is saying to Timothy, what Paul is saying to Timothy is true of the Christian life. It is what he wrote in 1 Corinthians 9, if we turn there. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 25 through 27. And every man that striveth for the mastery, everyone, no one is so illogical to think that they can just compete. Every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate. He has self-control. He has discipline in all things. In all things. His sleep, his diet, everything. He's temperate. He has control. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. So he's making a comparison. I therefore so run, as not uncertainly. So fight I, not as one that beateth the air. But I keep under my body, and bring it into subjection. That's discipline. That's discipline. Lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. He's making a comparison between physical discipline and spiritual discipline. What he's saying is we must submit ourselves to serious training. Spiritually, if we're going to live the Christian life, we have to submit personally to serious training. I can go to church and watch others, but that's not training. Just like you can go to the gym and watch others train, but it's not going to make you any better off. You can't have someone exercise for you. It doesn't work that way. This requires serious spiritual discipline. The reality of the Christian life demands Spiritual discipline. The word exercise, several things we need to notice. It's present tense. That is, it's always. It's habitual. It's an ongoing process. We're to exercise always unto godliness. We're to be habitual. Ongoing process. Exercise, exercise, exercise. What is the goal? Godliness. Godliness. It is also active voice. It's something that we are to do. Again, no one can do it for us. It is imperative mood. That is, it is an absolute necessity. It is either do this or you don't. There's no middle ground. There's no halfway point. It is second person singular. That is, it's personal and individual. Exercise thyself. We should always be disciplining ourselves. Spiritually, I'm talking about spiritual discipline. Always making the choice to exert energy in the matter of spirituality. This is where I'm going to put my energy. In spiritual things. And in doing that, I have to say no to a lot of other things so that I can pursue godliness. So it is exercise thyself. That is, take personal responsibility for your spiritual life. Exercise thyself. You take the responsibility of your spiritual life. I've been blamed many times for someone not growing, for someone not being as spiritual as they ought to be. I don't take that responsibility. That's their responsibility. People have to own their responsibility. All Paul told Timothy was, you put them in remembrance, and you'll be a good minister. That's what he told him. You can't do it for them. You just remind them over and over and over again. Take personal responsibility for your spiritual life. Well, if such and such, no. Take personal responsibility. If it wasn't for my husband, if it wasn't, take personal responsibility. It's called discipline. Discipline. Exercise requires personal energy. It requires personal exertion. It requires a regiment. Exercise thyself unto godliness. This exercise is inclusive of Bible reading. Well, I don't have time. Discipline. Discipline yourself. You have to say no to some things so you can have the time. Discipline. Discipline. It includes prayer. Oh, I want to pray, but I've got 18 kids and I just don't have the time. Discipline. It all comes back to discipline. Quit blaming your spirituality on everything else. Discipline. Requires church. Got to get to church. Discipline. Again, go back to the athlete training. He's pushing himself. He's pushing himself. Many times people need to pretend churches work and push themselves to get there. They get to work. They can't be in the house of God because they have no spiritual discipline. It takes discipline Things are going to happen, but it requires discipline. Fellowship with others requires discipline. Exercise thyself unto godliness. This requires personal desire. That athlete wants the prize. He has a desire for it. And that desire controls his life. And our desire for godliness ought to be so strong that it controls our life. It requires focus, and dedication, and commitment. Let's face it. God's people today have little spiritual desire. They have little to no focus on the things of the Lord. They have little dedication. They have little commitment. Therefore, everything else gets in the way. If you're truly committed and dedicated, you don't allow things to get in the way. You push through. You push through. You push through. If we're going to thrive as children of God in this corrupt and twisted world, we have to have spiritual discipline. We have to be able to push. There must be self-control over our spiritual diet, over our spiritual activities, over our choices. The word exercise includes all of these things. It's inclusive of proper attention. Notice verse 13. Till I come, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine, discipline requires that we give attention to the right things. It is inclusive of using what God has given you. Verse 14, neglect not the gift that is in thee. Don't neglect it. Use it. Use what God has given you. Have the discipline not to allow anyone or anything get in the way. You use what God has given you. It is inclusive of saturating the mind. Verse 15, meditate upon these things. Focus on the right things. Focus. That takes discipline. To be a person of focus. Not allowing other things to get in the way. That takes discipline. It's being filled with the Spirit of God. It requires surrender. He says in verse 15, give thyself wholly to them. Entirely. You give yourself, you put everything in you in it. And then he says, take heed. That is, be aware at all times. Be watching, recognize. What? What everyone else is doing or not doing? No, take heed unto thyself. Claim responsibility for your spirituality. Take heed unto thyself. Well, so-and-so did such and such. Take heed unto thyself. Have the discipline to get beyond what so-and-so did. Take heed unto thyself. And the goal is what? Godliness. Getting this godliness. Take heed unto thyself, unto the doctrine. Continue. Keep on. Push yourself. Continue in them. And by having this discipline, verse 16, take heed unto thyself and unto doctrine, continue in them, for in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee. You will not only benefit yourself, you'll benefit those around you as well. Discipline. So what is the purpose of this godliness or this discipline? Exercise thyself rather unto godliness. That is the goal, and that is the aim of the discipline. We are disciplining ourselves so that we can grow in this godliness. Discipline and train and prepare in view of godliness. That's the prize. That's what we're striving for. Godliness. That Godward attitude of reverence, piety, the root of all godly living, resulting in godly deeds and words. Exercise, discipline thyself. Again, we've already seen what this godliness is, this in the first message. It is what Paul says in Philippians 3:12. I follow after. I'm pursuing it. He says, reaching forth. I'm reaching for it. Stretching. I press toward. Discipline yourself to remove everything that would be a hindrance to such. It is pursue godliness. You don't just drift into a marathon. And you don't drift into godliness either. You don't just wander into it. Exercise thyself. The discipline must possess our life. We have to want godliness so bad, so much, that it affects our entire life. Then he makes a comparison. In verse 8, there's a comparison between the physical and the spiritual. The athlete disciplines their body. We are to discipline our soul. Bodily exercise. And he's not rebuking bodily exercise here. That's not what he's doing. Bodily exercise is limited in extent, and it is limited in duration. There is a temporal profit. But bodily exercise is restricted to this life only. It is bodily exercise profiteth little. It does profit. But he's making a comparison. Again, he's not in any way rebuking or condemning bodily exercise. He's not saying it's worthless. That's not what he's saying. He's making a comparison. And he says, it profiteth little. That is, a little bit for a little while. But godliness is, present tense, profitable unto all things. What he's making a comparison. He's teaching us it is a matter of priority. Godliness must be a priority. So much so that we discipline our lives. Spiritual discipline is better than physical discipline. We need physical discipline. We need it. But spiritual discipline is superior. So the Olympian, month after month, year after year, is in preparation. They're preparing for that prize. And if we are to excel spiritually, it takes a long-term commitment. It takes a long-term commitment to spiritual discipline. In verse 8, Paul is making the case for spiritual discipline. And oh, how we need spiritual discipline today. And then he makes confirmation. In verse 9, he basically endorses what He has said. He says this is a trustworthy statement, deserving of full acceptance. Paul uses similar statements in the pastoral epistles. 1 Timothy 1, verse 15, chapter 3, verse 1, 2 Timothy 2:11, Titus 3, verse 8. We find this phrase or something similar to it. What he's saying by this is not a secondary matter. This isn't something you should put off. This spiritual discipline, this exercise unto godliness, is not something it's not a secondary matter. And he makes this statement to verse 9 to flag our attention. It's a reminder that what he is saying is a matter of extreme importance. We have to have spiritual discipline. Because everything in life comes down to, we make choices every day. And that is true spiritually also. So what Paul says in verse 9 refers back to what he said in verse 7 and 8. He's saying you need to welcome this into your life. Exercise thyself unto godliness. This is a primary issue. This is a primary issue. It is not just for a few people, but for all of God's people. Spiritual discipline in pursuing godliness. This is critically important. Discipline your time, your schedule for Bible reading, for prayer. You don't just do it every now and then. You discipline your time for Bible reading, for prayer. Well, I don't really feel like it today. Push yourself! This is important. Push yourself. Pretend it's like something you want to do. Something that doesn't really matter. Push yourself toward Bible reading and prayer and church. Well, I don't really feel like going to church. I'm tired. Push yourself. Get past it. Requires discipline. Oh, how we need spiritual discipline. This is not incidental, but it's fundamental to growth in godliness. In verse 10, Paul declares that he has poured himself into this discipline. For therefore we both labor and suffer reproach, because we trust in the living God, who is the Savior or provider of all men, especially of those that believe. He's telling us now where we get our strength for this discipline. He's the provider of all, unsaved and saved, but especially of His own people. That's where we get our strength. There's nothing half-hearted about this. Just like the athlete in training, they don't do it half-heartedly. They've given their lives. He uses the word labor there in verse 10. Exert energy in spiritual matters. Work in spiritual matters. Exert energy and work to the point of exhaustion in spiritual matters. Give yourself fully and completely. This requires discipline. Oh, that our lives would be marked by spiritual discipline. And they will be if we see the value of what we're striving for. Godliness. To be more godlike. And oh, that we would have the discipline to push ourselves in that direction. Push ourselves in that direction. God help us. God give us the spiritual discipline that we need. And we would be in constant training, constant preparation. It prepares us for what is ahead. Spiritual health prepares us for what is ahead. You hear of people all the time, they have to have emergency surgery. And it's going to be very dangerous because this person's just not in very good physical shape. Or this person has a good chance of surviving because they're in excellent physical shape. Makes a difference. Makes a difference how we can handle the future, and so it is spiritually. We have no idea what we're going to face, what we might have to experience. But we can be prepared by exercising ourselves unto godliness. Most of God's people are in terrible spiritual shape. They're physically too, but most are in terrible spiritual shape. They really are. They get tired so easy. Doesn't take much. Doesn't take much to get them off track. It can be the littlest thing. Oh, how we need to see the value of godliness. And that we would discipline ourselves in a pursuit of godliness. Brother Dave, if you'd come and